4 months after burying her husband, Abigail Wright has nothing left but a half-empty flour sack, 3 hungry children, and a signature she was forced to write on a dead man's debt. But somewhere under the floorboards of her own home is a piece of paper that could tear a tyrant's empire down to the dirt. If she can stay alive long enough to use it. In Pale Creek, Texas, the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's a widow who knows exactly what her husband signed. Stay right here, because this story will show you what real courage looks like when it has no choice but to stand up. If it moves you, hit like, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
The floorboards didn't lie. Wood kept a tally when everything else failed. Abigail Wright stood in the center of the kitchen and let her eyes move across the room, tracking what was left. 3 wooden chairs, seasoned with oil from old grease and years of sitting. 2 iron pots, heavy enough to break a man's toes, resting cold on the iron stove. A small sewing basket that had belonged to a mother-in-law she barely remembered. And on the table, a single cotton sack of flour. It wasn't a full sack. The twine at the top had been cut 4 weeks ago, right around the time the north wind stopped howling, and the dry Texas dust began to settle into the window tracks. The cotton was gray from the stove soot, dipping inward, where the white dust had been scooped out ounce by ounce to keep 3 small bellies from rubbing against their backbones. 4 months since Thomas went into the ground at Medina Creek. 4 months of counting outside, the town of Pale Creek didn't make a sound. It wasn't a town built for noise. It was 300 souls, a single dry goods store, a livery that smelled of wet straw, and a circuit judge who only came through when the circuit wasn't muddy. Abby reached out, her fingers dusting the coarse weave of the flour sack. "Wyatt," she called. Her voice didn't carry. She didn't want it to. The screen door gave a short, metallic whine. Wyatt stood on the threshold, 12 years old, and carrying himself like a fence post that had seen too many winters. His shoulders were squared, tight beneath a denim shirt that had grown 2 inches short at the wrists. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at the dust on his boots. "He's coming up the ridge," Wyatt said. "I know. He's got the sheriff with him, Ma, and that man from the livery." Abby didn't look out the window. She didn't need to see the bay horses or the high-spring buggy to know the shape of Gideon Blackwood. Gideon didn't move fast, but he moved with the weight of every dollar he'd ever lent. Beside the stove, Sadie was sitting on a low stool, her thumbs working over the head of a faceless rag doll. She kept her eyes down, her small fingers rhythmically smoothing the calico skirt, over and over until the fabric was slick. In the corner bed, 6-year-old Toby shifted under the quilt, his breath coming in the short, dry catches of a child whose fever had broken, but whose strength hadn't come back to meet it. Abby walked over to the bed, tucked the edge of the quilt beneath Tobias' chin, and smoothed his hair. Her palm felt the lingering heat in his skin. She turned to Wyatt. Her voice was steady, the rhythm slow, matching the beat of a clock that didn't care about the news. "Listen to me, Wyatt," she said, looking straight into his gray eyes. "A man with a badge and a ledger can make a lot of noise about what you owe him. But a debt is just a number on a piece of paper. It isn't a brand on your skin. You remember that. No matter what he says today, your blood doesn't belong to the Blackwood store." Wyatt's jaw tightened. A sharp nod. "Once. He says Pa signed the book." "Your father signed for $40 of seed grain," Abby said, her voice dropping an octave, hard as cold iron. "He didn't sign away the right for his children to walk down the middle of the road. There's a difference between paying what's fair and letting a man buy your life for the price of your supper. Don't you ever confuse the two." The sound of iron shoes on dry dirt stopped outside. A horse snorted. A leather boot hit the porch plank with a flat, hollow thud. Abby didn't wait for the knock. She stood by the table, her hand resting lightly on the gray cotton of the flour sack, her spine perfectly straight. She had learned early from her father, when he was still teaching school in a tent out near the Brazos, that a person's height didn't come from the soles of their boots. It came from the refusal to bend when the wind blew foul. The door pushed open. Gideon Blackwood filled the frame. He wasn't a large man by girth, but he wore a wool coat that made him look broad, his gray beard trimmed clean right above his collar. On his right hand, a heavy gold signet ring caught the gray light from the door. Behind him stood Sheriff Briggs, his hat held in his hand, looking at the floorboards like he was trying to find a missing coin. "Abigail?" Gideon said. He took off his hat. His voice was smooth like oil on a carriage axle. "It's a cold morning for April. The wood's holding out, Gideon," Abby said. Gideon looked at the table. He looked at the sack of flour. His eyes lingered there for 3 seconds, long enough to count the cups left inside. "I brought the ledger, Abby," he said softly. He laid a leather-bound book on the table, right next to the flour. Thomas was a good neighbor, a hard worker, but the store can't carry a balance through the spring planting. $80, including the interest from last fall and the provisions brought out after the funeral. 80, Abby repeated. She didn't blink. Her memory went back to the night Thomas sat at this very table, his thumb tracing a pencil line. $4 for the red May wheat, Abby. Just 40 to get us through to the harvest. "The ledger doesn't lie, Abby," Gideon said, his fingers tapping the leather cover. "A contract is the only thing keeping this territory from turning back into a wilderness. Without the law of the ledger, we're just animals in the brush." Abby looked down at the book. She could see the edge of the paper inside, the neat, small ink strokes. She could read every word from where she stood. She knew the anti-peonage laws from the federal books her father used to keep on the shelf. Laws passed 11 years ago that said no man could be held to labor for a store bill. But federal laws didn't ride into Pale Creek on a buggy. Gideon Blackwood did. "I don't have $80 in silver, Gideon," she said. "I know you don't," Gideon replied. He reached out, his hand sliding a fresh sheet of paper across the wood. "The law allows for an agreement, a labor covenant. You and the boy help with the spring shearing at the home ranch. The girl can help in the main kitchen. 3 meals a day, a roof over your heads, and 25 cents a day credited against the balance." Abby calculated the math before he finished speaking. 25 cents a day, 6 days a week. It would take nearly a year, provided he didn't charge them for the salt they ate or the shoes they wore out in his fields. It was a wheel that turned forever, keeping a person exactly where they started, in the dirt. She looked at Sadie, had stopped smoothing the dolless skirt. She was holding her breath. She looked at Toby, his small face pale against the gray quilt. The flour sack on the table wouldn't last the week. If she didn't sign, Gideon would take the chairs, the pots, and the stove before sundown. The sheriff would watch him do it, because the law in Pale Creek belonged to the man who paid the town clerk. Gideon offered the quill. The ink at the nib was black and wet. Abby took the pen. Her hand didn't shake. She looked at Gideon, her eyes steady as a hawk's over a ridge. "You call it an agreement, Gideon," she said, her voice cutting through the room's silence like a dry branch, snapping underfoot. "But you know as well as I do that when you take a woman's hunger and turn it into a fence, you aren't doing business. You're just putting a legal name on a cage. I'm signing this because my children need to eat today, But don't you ever think you bought our respect for $80? Gideon didn't anger. He simply nodded, his face smooth as a river stone. The law doesn't ask for your respect, Abigail, just your signature. She wrote her name, Abigail Wright. The ink dried fast in the roomless draft. Gideon took the paper, folded it twice with his thick fingers, and slid it into his coat pocket. He turned to the third man standing on the porch, the livery worker Abby didn't know. He pointed to the kitchen table. Leave the flour, Gideon. Take the chairs. The man stepped in, his boots heavy. He picked up two of the wooden chairs there, one under each arm, and walked out. He didn't look at Abby. Abby didn't move. She stood by the table, her arm resting on the gray cotton sack, her body forming a barrier between the man and her children. When the man came back for the third chair, she didn't shift an inch. He had to reach around her, his sleeve brushing her apron to take the last seat. "We'll expect you at the ranch by noon," Gideon said, putting his hat back on his head. "The wagon's outside for the bedding." He walked out, the sheriff following close behind, closing the door until the latch gave a small greasy click. The kitchen was large now, empty in the corners where the chairs had been. Abby stood there, the quill still between her fingers. She didn't look at the empty spaces. She looked at the flour sack. Through the small window, past the dust of Blackwood's buggy, she saw the main street. The tall stranger was still there, standing by the livery hitching post. He hadn't moved. He was leaning against the cedar rail, his hat tilted low, his eyes fixed on her kitchen door. Every other man in Pale Creek had looked away when the chairs came out. This one didn't. He just watched, his hands tucked into his gun belt, his shadow long and dark against the white dust of the road. Abby turned to Wyatt. She laid the quill down on the bare wood of the table. "Get the quilts, son," she said. Her voice had the rhythm of the trail, now short, measured, moving forward because standing still wasn't an option. "We've got a noon deadline." The bay horse had a split in her near forehoof, right down the center of the wall, clean into the quick. It wasn't a wound from a rock. It was the kind of rot that came from too many days in the bottomland mud, followed by 3 days of hard, baking limestone trail. Jesse Clanton sat on an upturned whiskey crate outside the livery stable and watched the blacksmith work. The smith was a broad-shouldered man named Silas, his leather apron stiff with old grease and horse sweat. He used a rasp with a rhythm that sounded like a man sawing green oak. Scritch, scritch, pause. Then a puff of gray horn dust blown into the April wind. 3 days, Silas said, without looking up from the hoof held between his knees. Maybe 4 if the heat stays up. You crowd that mare before the horn hardens, and she throw a shoe and take half the coffin bone with it. Jesse chewed on a stem of dry grama grass. He didn't look at the horse. He looked down the length of the main street. "I ain't in a hurry," Jesse said. His voice was low, dried out by sand and tobacco. He didn't use 3 words when 2 would do the work. When a man spent 10 years keeping his name off the county ledgers, his tongue got out of the habit of making conversation. Across the road, Blackwood's high spring buggy was coming back down the ridge. Jesse watched it. He didn't shift his weight on the crate, but his right hand dropped 2 inches, his thumb catching the edge of his oiled leather gun belt. It wasn't a conscious movement. It was just the way his body remembered how to sit when a man with silver on his harness came into view. In the back of Blackwood's freight wagon, behind the buggy, sat Abigail Wright and her 3 kids. They looked small against the high sideboards. The 12-year-old boy, Wyatt, was holding a bundle of gray quilts, tied together with a length of hemp rope. The girl was clutching a doll. The little one was just a heap under an old wool coat. They didn't look like people moving to a new house. They looked like people who had been cleared out after a fire. Jesse watched the wagon turn toward the north road, the road that led to Blackwood's home ranch. Silas let the mare stiff drop with a heavy thud into the dirt. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of black soot across his forehead. He looked at the wagon, then he looked at Jesse. "That's the right," Silas said, his voice dropping low, his eyes tracking the dust cloud behind the freight wagon. Thomas Wright passed back in the winter. Real shame. Blackwood's taking them in out at the home place, giving them work to clear up the store bill. Jesse spat out the grandma grass. He looked at the black signet ring on Blackwood's finger as the buggy passed the livery. The eagle on the gold face caught the sun. "Taking them in," Jesse repeated. "That's right," Silas said, reaching for his rounding hammer. "Gideon's a fair man. Most fellas would have just taken the team and left the widow to walk to the railhead. He's giving 'em 3 meals and a roof." Jesse stood up. He was a tall man, his buckskin jacket thin at the elbows, his boots worn down at the outside of the heel from miles of walking horses through the brush. He looked down at the blacksmith. "There's a word for that kind of fairness, Silas," Jesse said, his voice level flat as a prairie pond. "But it ain't a word you will find in a church book. When you take a widow-s team, you read just a thief. But when you take her time and you tell her she-s, working off a dead man-s interest, you read something worse. You're using the law to do what a bandit does with a piece of lead." Silas stopped his hammer mid-air. His face went tight. "Gideon S. got the book, stranger. A debt's a debt." "A debt's a number, Silas," Jesse said, stepping out into the light of the doorway. "But a man-s time is his life. The federal law down in Austin says you can bind a person to a field because of a store bill. They called it peonage when the Mexicans did it out west. And they call it a crime now. A man's labor belongs to his own skin, not to the fella who owns the corn crib." Silas didn't answer. He turned back to the anvil and brought the hammer down on a cold shoe. Clang. The sound was too loud for the small valley. Jesse walked away from the livery. He didn't go to the saloon. He walked down to the public well at the edge of the street, where the water pump handle was rusted red from the alkali in the soil. He sat on the edge of the wooden trough and waited. By noon, the boy came back. Wyatt was driving a single-horse flatbed with 3 empty water barrels in the back. His face was red from the sun, his small hands grimed with the black grease. From the wagon hub, he backed the horse up to the pump with a short, sharp jerk, on the lines that showed he'd been taught, by a man who knew teamwork. Jesse didn't move. He let the boy unhitch the tailgate. Wyatt took the pump handle. It took both his hands and the whole weight of his 12-year-old frame to bring the first stream of gray water out of the spout. Creak-clack, creak-clack. "That's heavy water for a boy," Jesse said. Wyatt didn't stop. He kept his eyes on the iron spout. "I ain't a boy when I'm working, mister. Your father teach you how to back a flatbed like that?" The handle went up. Stabbed. Wyatt looked over his shoulder, his gray eyes old, deep set beneath his hat brim. "My pa taught me a lot of things before he went down at the creek." Jesse reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of whittled cedar. He'd spent the morning shaping it into the likeness of a small roadrunner bird, the tail feathers notched out with 3 strokes of a pocket knife. He laid it on the edge of the water trough. "Found this by the livery," Jesse said. Wyatt looked at the cedar bird. He didn't reach for it. His hand stayed on the iron pump handle, his knuckles white. "We don't take charity, mister. Ma says charity's just a hook with a worm on it." Jesse nodded. He didn't take the bird back. "That ain't charity, son. That is, just a piece of wood that don't belong to nobody. But your mass right about the hook. You remember this? About the frontier. The fellas who come to you with their hats in their hands, talking about how much they want to help your family. Usually the ones who we've already figured out what your timber's worth by the foot. Wyatt looked down at the cedar bird again. Slowly, his hand came off the iron. He picked up the wood, his thumb tracing the smooth notch of the tail. Mr. Blackwood says we owe him $80, Wyatt whispered. I heard. My pa didn't borrow 80, the boy said, his voice dropping until it was nearly lost in the creak of the wagon springs. I was under the stairs. I saw the gold pieces on the table. There was 4 of them, $10 eagles. That S-40. He didn't sign for no 80. Jesse sat very still. The wind came through the gap in the hills, carrying the smell of dry cedar and old ash. He knew that gold. He knew the look of a man who changed the numbers in a ledger after the ink was dry on the signature. Where's the paper your pa took home? Jesse asked. Must got it, Wyatt said. No, I got it. I hid it before they put the padlock on the door. Under the big pine plank by the cook stove. Jesse stood up. His shadow fell across the boy, long and thin, covering the water barrels and the horse hip. You keep that paper dry, Wyatt, Jesse said. Why? Because a piece of paper with the truth on it is like a dry cartridge, Jesse said, his hand dropping back to his belt. It don't make no noise while it's sitting in your pocket. But when the time comes to pull the trigger, it's the only thing that'll save your hide. Jesse turned and walked back toward the boarding house. The bay mare was still lame in the livery. He had 3 days of waiting ahead of him. He'd spent 10 years running from every fire he'd ever seen start on this range. He'd told himself he was just a drifter, just a man passing through, just a fellow with a horse and a name nobody needed to know. He went into his small room at Mrs. Henderson's house. He didn't unpack his saddlebags. He just laid them on the floor by the window, where he could see the north road. He pulled his Colt .45 from its holster. He laid it on the quilt, took out a rag, and began to wipe down the cylinder. The steel was blue, cold to the touch. He knew every scratch on the barrel. He knew the weight of it. He thought about the woman's eyes when she signed her name on Blackwood's paper. She hadn't looked at the sheriff. She'd looked at the flour sack, like she was calculating how many loaves of bread she could get before she had to ask for another favor. Jesse looked out the window. The dust from the flatbed wagon was just a thin gray line against the mesquite ridge. He didn't want to stay in Pale Creek. The air smelled like old sins. But he looked at his hands, the sayo on his left wrist from an old Logan Vance raid. And he knew he wasn't going to saddle that bay mare when the 3 days were up. The grease in the Blackwood Ranch kitchen was different from the grease at the relay station. It was old pig fat, burned onto the bottom of 18-inch iron skillets until it looked like black enamel. Abigail Wright spent her 3rd morning at the home place, scrubbing those skillets with lye water and river sand. Her hands were already red, the skin at the knuckles splitting from the caustic soap. Every time she dipped her arms into the wash tub, the water stung like a hornet bite. But she didn't look up from the iron. She had 18 men to feed by noon shearers from the lower counties, fellows with grease on their chaps and wool dust in their hair. In the corner of the kitchen, Sadie was turning the crank on a heavy box churn. Her small arms were shaking from the drag of the thick cream. Thump slosh, thump slosh. Keep the rhythm, Sadie, Abby said, without turning around. Don't let the butter go sleepy in the box. When you start a job on this range, you carry it through at the same speed you started. If you slow down because your arms are tired, the cream just sits there and turns sour. and you've wasted the morning for nothing." Sadie blinked back a tear, her small chin trembling, but her hands kept the handle moving. Thump slosh. The kitchen door opened, and Gideon Blackwood walked in. He didn't look at the skillets. He walked over to the dry pantry shelf, picked up a small ledger, and dipped a steel pen into an inkwell he kept on a bracket by the window. "Abigail," he said, his pen scratching against the paper. "I credited your account for the first 3 days. 75 cents total for your kitchen work, and 30 cents for Wyatt's time with the water wagon." Abby wiped her soapy hands on her apron. She walked over to the table where he stood. "And what's the debit for the week, Gideon?" she asked. Gideon didn't look up from his column. $2.10 for the salt pork and the dry peas your family used. 90 cents for the room in the line shack. That leaves you $81.05 against the store. Abby stood perfectly still. Her mind didn't need a slate to do the tally. She had earned $1.05. He had charged her $3 for the right to breathe his air and eat his salt pork. After 3 days of breaking her back, she owed him more than she did the day she signed the paper. "The numbers don't go backwards, Gideon," Abby said, her voice thin as a knife blade. Gideon closed the ledger with a soft, leather-bound puff of air. "The numbers go where the contract says they go, Abby. A ranch ain't a church. Every pound of salt has to be hauled 60 miles from the railhead on a freighter wagon, and that freighter wants his silver cash. If I don't charge you for the haulage, I am paying for your supper out of my own pocket. That ain't business. That S. Just foolishness." Abby looked at his gold signet ring. The eagle on the face seemed to stare right back at her. "My husband didn't owe you $80, Gideon," she said. Gideon picked up his hat from the table. "Thomas signed the book, Abby. The sheriff saw the mark. If you have got a piece of paper that says different, you show it to Judge Henderson when he comes through in July. Until then, the ledger stands." He walked out, the heavy oak door slamming behind him, until the iron pans on the wall rattled like old bones. Abby didn't go back to the tub. She waited until the sound of his boots died away on the gravel path. "Wyatt," she whispered. The boy slipped out from the woodshed behind the pantry. He'd been listening through the cedar slats of the wall. He reached inside his denim shirt, his fingers working under the frayed wool lining, and pulled out a small, flat packet wrapped in oiled hog bladder. He laid it on the flour-dusted table. Abby didn't use a knife. She used her teeth to tear the twine off the bladder skin. She flattened the paper out between her red, wet palms. It was the receipt Thomas had taken from the store 6 months ago, back when the cotton was still in the square. The paper was yellowed at the corners from the smoke under the cabin floor, but the ink was clear. It was Thomas's hand-large, rough letters, the cross on the T dragging out to the edge of the page. "Received of Gideon Blackwood, $40 cash for seed wheat, to be repaid in grain at 70 cents a bushel after the threshing." There was no mention of interest. There was no mention of $80. And down at the bottom, below Thomas's signature, was a second name written in a small, shaky script that looked like a bird's track in the mud. "Witness, Silas Wade." Abby S. Breath came out in a long, slow whistle. "Silas," she said. "The blacksmith," Wyatt whispered. "He was working for Mr. Blackwood last fall before he bought the livery shop from Old Man Miller." Abby closed her eyes. Twist 1. The truth was right there on the pine table, smelling of old lard and pine smoke. Gideon hadn't just added interest to the ledger. He had waited until Thomas was cold in the ground. Then he'd taken a fresh sheet of paper, copied her husband S. signature onto the labor covenant, and doubled the number because he knew a widow couldn't ride 60 miles to the land office to check the record. "Ma," Wyatt said, his hand touching her wet apron. "What are we going to do with it?" Abby folded the paper back into its oilcloth sleeve. She didn't put it back in his shirt. She dropped it down the front of her own dress, tucked tight against her stays, where nobody could reach it without a fight. "We going to hold on to it, Wyatt," she said. "Can't we show the sheriff?" Abby looked out the high window. Down by the corral, she could see the tall stranger, Jesse Clanton. He was leaning against the cedar rail, his hands tucked into his gun belt, his eyes fixed on the kitchen chimney, like he was waiting for the smoke to turn white. "The sheriff is just a man with a tin star and a mortgage, Wyatt," Abby said, her voice dropping down into the rhythm she used when the children were small and the timber wolves were howling down by the creek. "He don't see nothing that isn't written in Blackwood's ledger. When you re-fighting a man who owns the store and the town, you don't go to his friends for help. You wait until you got enough powder to blow the whole house up at once. You don't waste your lead on a scout." She turned back to the tub. She picked up the sand rag and began to scrub the iron again. The sand gritted under her thumbs. Scritch, scritch. Through the glass, she saw Jesse Clanton turn away from the corral. He began to walk up the north road, his long legs moving with that slow, dangerous swing that told her he wasn't afraid of the dust or the men who made it. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he was thrown chait from. But as she watched his blue coat disappear into the green mesquite, Abby Wright felt the first cold breath of something that wasn't fear move through her kitchen. It was hope. And on the Texas frontier in 1878, hope was a far more dangerous thing than silver or lead. The gold on Gideon Blackwood's right hand had a greasy look. It wasn't the clean shine of river bottom ore. It was heavy, dull, and dark around the edges, where the engraving met the knuckle. A carved eagle with its wings stretched out wide, holding 3 arrows in its left claw. Jesse Clanton leaned against the cedar post, inside Blackwood's general store, and watched that ring move. Gideon was scooping coffee beans out of a dry barrel. Scrape, scrape. The tin scoop hit the staves with a flat, rhythmic hollow. Every time his wrist turned, the eagle caught the yellow light of the kerosene lamp hanging from the beam. "2 pounds, Gideon said. He didn't look at Jesse. He looked at the balance scale. "That'll be 60 cents, Jesse. I can put it on your account if you're planning to stay on through the shearing." Jesse didn't answer right away. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out 3 silver dimes and a pair of nickels, and laid them on the counter. The metal made a sharp, clean click against the pine wood. "Cash," Jesse said. Gideon picked up the silver. His hand stayed close to the counter for a second, the gold eagle sitting flat against the grain. Jesse looked at the ring. His eyes didn't move. 10 years of dust and trail miles went out of his head in a single breath. He was back in the brush country, near the Nueces River. A midnight sky filled with orange smoke. The smell of cedar timbers burning down into gray ash. He'd seen that ring before. He'd seen it on the hand of a man who sat on a black gelding in the timber, watching the Logan Vance riders torch a settler's cabin while a woman screamed from the lean-to. The client, the one who paid the Vance brothers $200 in gold to clear the valley before the surveyor arrived. "Something wrong with the money?" Gideon asked, his eyes narrowing. Jesse took his tobacco pouch out. His fingers were steady. "Money's just silver, Gideon," Jesse said, his voice dropping into that low, flat drawl that sounded like iron dragging over gravel. "It don't change its flavor just because it passed through a dirty hand. But a man is memory that a different piece of leather." You can scrub a ledger until the ink comes off, but you can wipe the smoke out of an old coat. It stays in the wool. Gideon took his hat off, wiped the brim with his sleeve, and put it back on. His face didn't change color. This is a dry country. Jesse, people remember the rain. They don't remember the dust. They remember the fire, Gideon, Jesse said, leaning in until his shadow cut off the light on the balance scale. When a man burns out a family because he wants the grass, he thinks he is just clearing the brush. But the ashes just don't stay in the valley. They blow over the ridge, they get into the water. A man can drink from a well 20 miles away and still taste the charcoal from a house he never saw. Gideon closed his ledger. The leather cover made a heavy thud. The store is closing, Mr. Clanton. The horses need feeding. Jesse picked up his coffee sack. He didn't say another word. He walked out into the April dusk, the screen door slapping behind him like a pistol shot in the quiet street. He didn't go to his room. He walked down to the livery stable where the bay mare was standing in the dark stall. The smell of wet straw and manure was thick, but behind it, Jesse could still smell the charcoal from 10 years ago. Silas. The blacksmith was in the back, cleaning his tongs with an oily rag. The forge was just a heap of red eyes dying down in the black dust. Jesse didn't stand in the doorway. He walked straight into the shadow of the anvil, his hand resting light on the iron horn. Silas, Jesse said. The blacksmith jumped, the tongs dropping onto the dirt floor with a dull clatter. Jesus, Jesse, you move like a mountain cat. You want to give a fellow a stroke? You were out at the home place 10 years ago, Silas, Jesse said. Silas reached for his pipe, his hands shaking, as he struck a lucifer against the brickwork. I was just a hand then, Jesse. I didn't have the shop. I did what the foreman told me. Thomas Wright didn't fall off no horse, Silas. The match went out. The darkness came back into the corner, thick and heavy. Silas didn't strike another light. He went down at Medina Creek, Silas whispered. The horse slipped on the limestone. Everybody knows that. Limestone don't leave a black mark on a horse hocks, Silas, Jesse said, his voice coming out of the dark like a knife slipping through a curtain. Twist 4. Thomas was riding to Clayton to see the federal marshal about that seed ledger. He had the original receipt. Your name was on it as a witness. Blackwood S. riders didn't wait for him to reach the county line. They threw a rawhide loop around his mare's forelegs and dragged her down the ridge. That ain't an accident. That's cess. Murder. And you've been shoeing their horses ever since because you too scared to look at your own anvil. Silas fell back against the grain bin, his breath coming in short, wet gasps. You would have ruined the town, Jesse. If the railroad found out there was a title dispute on the water right, they would have moved the tracks 5 miles north. The town would have died in the brush. A town built on a dead man's ribs ain't a town, Silas, Jesse said, his hand moving off the anvil, his fingers catching blacksmith's leather apron. It's just a graveyard with a post office. When you help a man hide a killing because you worried about the price of your coal, you aren't an honest mechanic no more. You're just an outrider for a bandit gang, and your anvil's nothing but an anvil-shaped lie. Silas began to weep, the tears leaving gray tracks through the soot on his cheeks. He told me he'd burn the shop, Jesse. He has got the mortgage on the building. I didn't have no choice. Every man's got a choice, Silas, Jesse said, letting the leather go. You just have to decide if you want to hang from a cedar limb with a clear conscience or live in a kitchen with a chain around your ankle. Jesse turned and walked out of the livery. The stars were coming out over Pale Creek, sharp and cold as broken glass. He looked north toward the Blackwood Ranch. He could see the yellow speck of the kitchen light where Abigail Wright was scrubbing the grease off the iron skillets he spent 10 years running from that old smoke. He told himself he didn't have no stakes in this valley. He told himself he was just a fellow with a lame mare and a bad name. But as he looked at his hand, the skin dark against the starlight, he knew he wasn't going to let the fire go out this time. He was going to find the powder keg, and he was going to hold the match until the whole valley saw the light. The roof of the old Methodist chapel had given way. 3 winters ago, cedar shingles dropping down into the pews like gray leaves after a hard frost. The altar was still there, split down the middle by a fallen beam, the wood bleached white by the Texas sun. Abigail Wright sat on the remains of the front steps and watched the mesquite brush. It was Sunday morning. The shearers were sleeping off the whiskey they'd drunk at the creek, and the ranch house was quiet. She'd told the foreman she was going to look for wild plums along the draw. But she didn't have a basket. She had Wyatt with her, his small hand tucked into her apron pocket. His thumb tracing the shape of the cedar roadrunner Jessie had whittled for him. A horse walked out of the brush. It wasn't Blackwood S. Bay. It was the lame mare, her hoof clicking soft against the gravel. Jesse Clanton dismounted before the horse stopped. He didn't have his Winchester in the scabbard, but his Colt was riding low on his thigh, the leather holster tied off at the bottom with a strip of rawhide. "You're late, Mr. Clanton," Abby said. "The sheriff was at the well," Jesse replied. He walked into the ruin of the church, his boots crunching on the rotten plaster. He looked at the split altar, then at Wyatt. "The boy bring the packet?" Wyatt reached into his shirt and pulled out the wrapper. He didn't give it to Jesse. He looked at his mother first. Abby nodded. "Give it to him, Wyatt. When you are putting your trust in a man on this range, you don't do it by halves. You look him in the eye, you give him the truth, and then you watch his hands. If his hands stay away from his pockets, you stay with him. If they don't, you find yourself a stouter piece of wood." Jesse took the paper. He didn't unwrap the oilcloth. He knew what was inside by the weight of it. "Twist 3, Silas talked," Jesse said. Abby stood up. Her dress was gray with dust, the hem torn from the catclaw briars along the draw. "What did he say?" He said, "Thomas had this paper when he went down at Medina Creek," he said. Blackwood S. riders took the team and the ledger, but they missed the boy under the stairs. They didn't know Thomas had told Wyatt where the real receipt was. Abby looked down at her hands, the skin at the knuckles white and cracked from the lye water. "Silas won't say that to the judge, Mr. Clanton. He's Assahanyacht. He has lived under Gideon's thumb so long his bones have turned to lard." "He'll talk if he has to," Jesse said. "I've seen men like Silas before. They ree like an old fence post. They stay upright as long as the weather is calm, but you put a little weight on, and they snap right at the ground line." Jesse reached down and picked up a piece of the broken altar. He looked at the white wood. "I'm going to take this." "Paper to Clayton, Abby," he said. "I'm going to find Marshal Harmon. He is a federal man. He don't owe Blackwood for his groceries." "No," Abby said. Jesse looked up, his eyebrows drawing together. "What do you mean, no?" "This is the evidence, ma'am. It's the only way out of that line shack. If you ride out of Pale Creek with that paper, Jesse, you won't make it to the county line," Abby said, her voice clear, matching the steady drone of the cicadas in the mesquite. "Gideon S. got 3 riders sitting on the ridge road right now. They aren't watching for cattle. They re-watching for you. A man who rides into an ambush with nothing but a piece of paper ain't a savior. Mr. Clanton, he's just a corpse with a legal argument." Jesse's jaw went hard. He laid his hand on the cylinder of his revolver. "I can handle 3 riders, Abby. You can handle 3 bullets, Jesse." But you can handle 4, Abby said, stepping into the church ruin until she was standing right across the split altar from him. That's what you outlaws never learn. You think every problem on the frontier can be settled with 6 inches of lead. But the law ain't a gunfight. The law is a web. If you break one strand with a pistol, the rest of it just tightens up around you until you can turn your head. We don't need a gunfight. We need the system to turn its teeth on Gideon. Jesse looked at her, really looked at her. He'd seen plenty of women on the frontier wives who wept when the well went dry, girls who looked at the dirt until their eyes went cloudy. But this widow had her father's pioneer blood in her. She didn't look at the dirt. She looked at the structure of the thing. The system belongs to Blackwood, Abby, Jesse said softly. The judge is his cousin's brother-in-law. The judge is a man, Abby said, and men have cracks in 'em. Wyatt, go wait by the mare. Keep your eyes on the ridge. The boy nodded and slipped out through the broken wall, his boots silent on the grass. Abby reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded note. It wasn't wrapped in oilcloth. It was just a scrap of ledger paper, written in a fine, elegant hand that didn't belong to a storekeeper or a blacksmith. "What's that?" Jessie asked. "That's a letter from Judge Henderson's wife," Abby said, her fingers smoothing the crease. "She came to the ranch house yesterday to buy eggs. She dropped this in the basket when Gideon wasn't looking." Jesse took the note. He held it up to the gray light of the doorway. "Tell the stranger to look at the 1871 land office books in Clayton." It read, "Gideon doesn't just own the town. He owns the judge's signature on a forged deed." Jesse looked from the paper to Abby's face. The cicadas in the brush seemed to get louder, filling the empty church with a sound like boiling water. "A forged deed," Jesse muttered. "Gideon tongue-teeing him," Abby said. "He's been doing it for 7 years. That's why Judge Henderson always rules for the store. He ain't a bad man, Jesse. He's just a trapped man. If we can give him a way out of Gideon's cage, he'll sign the warrant for the federal marshal himself." Jesse let out a long, slow breath. He wrapped the original receipt back in its bladder skin and handed it to Abby. "You're smarter than the Logan Vance gang, ma'am," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching with the first real smile he'd had in a year. "The Logan Vance gang is in the cemetery, Mr. Clanton," Abby said, taking the packet and sliding it back into her dress. "I intend to stay in my house. There's a difference." She walked out of the ruins, her head held up, her gray skirt brushing the dry, wild mustard stalks. Jesse watched her go. He looked down at the broken altar, then at his own hand. For 10 years, he'd believed his only skill was destruction, the fast draw, the hard ride, the clean getaway. But as he watched the widow's shadow move through the mesquite, he realized there was a different kind of strength on this range, a strength that didn't need a cartridge to make itself known. He reached down, picked up his horse's lines, and followed her into the brush. The porch at the Blackwood main house was cedar, planed smooth, and oiled twice a year to keep the Texas sun from splitting the grain. It didn't look like the rest of the county. It looked like a piece of Mississippi that had been cut out and dragged across the mud. Jesse Clanton spent the morning on his knees, replacing 3 rotted sill timbers beneath the porch deck. His hammer had a rhythm. Thud, thud. Then the pause, the rasp of his hand across the dry cedar shavings. He didn't work like a man trying to finish a job. He worked like a man to find where the timber went hollow. By 11 o'clock, the screen door clicked. Gideon Blackwood walked out, holding a pitcher of well water and 2 tin cups. He wasn't wearing his wool coat today. He had on a white linen shirt, the sleeves turned up twice at the wrists, but the gold eagle ring was still sitting flat against his knuckle. "Drink some water, Jesse," Gideon said, setting the pitcher on a cedar bench. A man who don't wet his whistle in April is just inviting the sunstroke to take him by the neck. Jesse sat back on his boot heels. He took the tin cup, but he didn't drink right away. He let the iron-cold water sit against his palm, cooling the blisters from the ads. "You got good timber under here, Gideon," Jesse said. Gideon leaned against the porch rail, his eyes looking out over the home pasture where 500 head of white-faced cattle were moving toward the tanks. "I brought those sills in from the eastern counties back in '68, Gideon said, his thumb tracing the gold eagle on his hand. "Cost me $4 a log just for the hauling. People told me I was a fool, said the local post oak would hold up just fine." Jesse took a slow swallow of the water. He didn't look down at his tools. He kept his eyes on Gideon's boots. "Post oak rots from the inside out," Jesse said. "That's right," Gideon replied, a small, tight smile moving under his gray beard. "That's what the drifters don't understand about this country, Jesse. They think you can just drop a corner post in the dirt and call it a home. But the dirt in Texas is hungry. It eats wood. It eats iron. If you don't build with something that has been seasoned in the fire, the soil will just take your house back before your kids are big enough to cut the firewood." Jesse stood up, his boots heavy on the fresh cedar deck. He looked Gideon straight in the eye. "The fire don't season a log, Gideon," Jesse said, his voice dropping into that low, flat gravel that made the cattle down by the fence lift their heads. "It just leaves a crust on the outside. If the core of the timber was rotten when it was standing in the bottomland, the smoke don't make it clean. It just hides the decay until a hard winter comes along and pushes the roof down onto your bed. You can buy a straight foundation with a stolen gold piece." Gideon's went still on the rail. The smile didn't leave his eyes, but it went hard like a pond freezing over after a blue norther. "Thomas Wright was a post oak man, Jesse," Gideon said softly. "He had a lot of big talk about what he was going to do with that relay station. He wanted to build an orchard. He wanted to bring a schoolmaster down from the north. But he didn't look at his ledger. He didn't see that his well was running dry before he even got the seed in the ground." "His well didn't run dry, Gideon?" Jesse said. Gideon picked up his tin cup and took a measured sip. "A well is only as deep as the credit that dug it, Mr. Clanton. When a settler thinks he can just live off his own muscle without paying his respect to the man who owns the supply wagon, he's already thirsty. He just don't know it yet. The frontier don't have room for fellows who want to be independent, but can't pay for their own salt." Jesse didn't answer. He picked up his adze and went back to the sill timber, his swing short and precise, taking off a thin ribbon of red wood with every stroke. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Gideon stayed on the porch for 5 more minutes, watching the ribbons fall into the dirt. He didn't offer another cup of water. He just turned and walked back into the house, the oak door closing with that heavy, legalistic thud that Jesse had learned to hate. By noon, Jesse walked down to the line shack at the edge of the creek bed. The shack was small, built of rough-sawn pine that had warped until you could slide a dollar piece between the planks. Inside, Abby Wright was standing over a 3-legged iron stove, turning a piece of salt pork in a greasy skillet. The room smelled of old damp and wood smoke, but the table was scrubbed white as a bone. Wyatt was sitting on the floor in the corner, a piece of charcoal between his fingers, drawing lines on the back of an old lard crate. Jesse didn't go inside the doorframe. He stood on the dirt sill, his hat in his hand. "Blackwood knows," Jesse said. Abby didn't look up from the skillet. "Gideon always knows when a man's looking at his foundation, Mr. Clanton. He built this ranch by finding the rotten spots in every fellow within 30 miles. He got 3 riders sitting on the ridge road by Medina Creek, Jesse said. They ain't working the cattle. They got their carbines booted on their saddles. Abby turned the meat over. The grease gave a loud, angry spit against the iron. A tyrant don't keep his power with his ledger, Jesse. He keeps it because the people in the valley are too busy looking at the ground to see who's holding the rope. When a man owns the only store in 30 miles, he don't need to be a judge. He just waits until you re-hungry enough to tell him that his lie looks like the gospel. Jesse looked at Wyatt's drawing on the crate. The boy had drawn the shape of the Pale Creek Valley, with lines running from the hills down to the center road like a spider's web. The boy's got a good eye, Jesse said. His father taught him to map the water lines, Abby said, her voice dropping into that steady, quiet rhythm. Thomas used to tell him that the man who maps the range owns the future, even if he don't have the deed in his pocket today. If you know where the water moves under the stone, you don't have to ask the landlord for permission to be thirsty. You just wait until the dry season shows everybody who has been lying about the well. Jesse stepped back into the gravel path. He looked up at the ridge where the mesquite was turning gray in the heat. I'm going to ride to the livery tonight, Jesse said. Silas has got to sign that affidavit before the judge comes through. If he don't, I'll take his rounding hammer and show him what a broken leg looks like. Abby walked to the door, her red hands holding the edge of the screen frame. You can't break a man into being brave, Jesse, she said, her eyes locked on his scars. An outlaw thinks you can settle a dispute by putting more iron in the scale. But if you force Silas to sign with a hammer, Gideon will just bring 3 men with bigger hammers tomorrow, and the law will call them the posse. We don't need more weight, Mr. Clanton. We need a lever, and a lever don't work unless you find the exact spot where the stone is ready to split. Jesse looked down at his own boots. He'd spent 10 years believing that a man with a gun was the only independent thing on the frontier. But as he looked at the widow standing in the door of that warped line shack, he realized that a piece of straight cedar and an unbought tongue could hold up a roof better than all the lead in his belt. Where's the lever, Abby? He asked. The judge, she said. The judge is coming to Pale Creek on Tuesday night. He don't stay at the hotel. He stays at Mrs. Henderson's house because she's his wife, sister. You be in that parlor before the lamp goes out. The parlor at Mrs. Henderson's house smelled of dried lavender and vinegar water. It was a small room, crowded with horsehair chairs and oval frames containing portraits of dead people who had lived in Tennessee before the war. Circuit Judge Henderson sat in the corner by the cold fireplace, a wool shawl over his knees despite the April heat. His hair was white, thin as corn silk, and his hands were spotted with the brown liver marks of a man who had spent 40 years sitting in small rooms, listening to people lie about horses and landlines. On the small table beside him sat a bottle of medicinal port and a Bible with a broken spine. Abigail Wright stood by the velvet door curtain. She didn't sit down, though the judge had gestured to a stool twice. Abigail, the judge said, his voice dry and rattling like dry beans in a bladder. Your father was a schoolmaster, a man of letters. He understood that the law is an orderly house. If we tear down the roof because we don't like the color of the shingles, we all freeze in the winter. Abby reached into her pocket and laid the scrap of ledger paper, the note from his own wife, flat on the Bible. The roof is already leaking, Judge, Abby said. The old man looked at the paper. His eyes didn't widen. They just seemed to sink back into his head, his lower lip trembling, until he had to catch it with his teeth. Gideon Blackwood has the 1871 county book. Henderson whispered, his hand drifting toward the port bottle, but stopping before he touched us. If that book goes to the district court in Austin, my name comes off the roll. My children won't be able to buy a loaf of bread in this state without people looking at the floor. Abby walked closer, her coarse linen apron brushing the horsehair arm of his chair. Your children are already looking at the floor, Judge, she said, her voice clear and measured as a school bell. Every time you sign your name to an illegal, Kitty, because you re-scared of Gideon S. book. You aren't protecting your name. You just spreading the rot down to the next generation. A child don't inherit his father's honor from a title. He learns it by watching his father stand up when the landlord tells him to lie. Henderson covered his face with his spotted hands. You don't know what it's like, Abby. The frontier don't give a man a second chance. If you fall once in the mud, they use you for a corduroy road until you re-dead. They only use you if you stay down, sir, Abby said, her hand coming down flat on the open Bible. The law isn't a trap that Gideon built. It's an engine that belongs to the people who have the courage to turn the wheel. If you sign an affidavit stating that your signature on the Calloway deed was obtained through coercion, the federal marshal in Clayton has to take the ledger out of Gideon's store. The federal court don't care about an old land dispute from 71. They care about an American citizen being held to labor for a bag of flour in 1878. The old man looked up, his eyes watery, his mouth working silently for 10 seconds before the words came out. Gideon's riders are at the creek, Abby. They won't let a messenger through to Clayton. The velvet curtain moved. Jesse Clanton stepped into the lamplight. He didn't have his hat on, but his blue key-bin jacket was buttoned to the neck, and his Colt was sitting forward in its leather holster. The messenger is already gone, Judge, Jesse said. Henderson went stiff in his chair, his feet drawing back under the shawl. Who are you, stranger? My name is Clanton, Jesse said, walking over to the mantelpiece and leaning against the stone. Him's the fellow who held the horse while Logan Vance burned out the Forsyth family 10 years ago. I've been running from that smoke through 5 states, thinking the law was nothing but a rope waiting for my neck. But the widow here showed me something I'd forgotten. The law ain't a noose until a rogue gets his hand on the end of it. If you sign that paper tonight, you aren't just saving her family. You're taking the rope out of Gideon S. hand and giving it back to the marshal. Henderson looked from Jesse's blue coat to Abby's red, split knuckles. He saw the structure of the thing now, the way the widow's literate mind and the drifter-s iron leg had come together to form a corner post that Gideon hadn't calculated. Silas won't back me, the judge whispered. He's terrified. Silas signed his name an hour ago, Jesse said, pulling a second sheet of paper from his vest. Twist 5. I didn't use no hammer on him either. I just sat on his anvil and told him about the woman and the 2 kids who died in the fire out by the Newisses because I was too hentate to walk through the door. I told him that a man who carries a secret like that for 10 years don't have nothing left but a pile of ash in his chest. He looked at his own forge, and he picked up the pen. The room went quiet. The only sound was the oil bubbling in the glass lamp on the table. Judge Henderson reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his gold spectacles. He fitted them over his ears with trembling fingers. Then he reached for the steel pen lying on the Bible. If I do this, Abigail, he said, his voice going steady for the first time, the old tone of the bench coming back into his throat. The county will be tore up by the roots. There will be no credit at the store on Wednesday morning. The farmers won't be able to get a sack of salt or a pound of iron without silver cash. A community don't change its landlord without paying a hard price in the kitchen. Abby reached into her pulled out the wrapped hog bladder packet, flattening her husband's original receipt next to his inkwell. "We've been paying the price in the kitchen since the day Thomas died, Judge," she said, her spine perfectly straight against the Tennessee portraits. "A community that eats credit from a murderous hand is just fattening itself for the slaughterhouse. We rather eat parched corn with a clean conscience than fat pork from a ledger that was signed with a lie. Give us the warrant, and let the valley see what the truth looks like when it rides in on a federal horse." The judge dipped the pen. The steel point made a sharp, clean scratch against the paper. Circuit Judge Marcus Henderson. He didn't use the sandbox to dry the ink. He let it sit wet on the white page, a dark line that cut through 7 years of silence, like a plow through old sod. Jesse Clanton took the paper. He didn't smile. He folded it once, carefully, and slid it into his vest next to his watch. "Marshal Harmon will be at the Medina Ridge by dawn," Jesse said. Abby looked at the wet ink on the table. She didn't feel the sting in her knuckles anymore. She looked at Jesse, her eyes steady as the North Star over the brush. "Be careful on the road, Mr. Clanton," she said. "I am always careful, ma'am," Jesse said, his hand dropping back to his rawhide tie-off. "But this is the first time I've ridden toward a fire with a bucket of water instead of a match." He walked out through the back door, his boots quiet on the porch planks, his shadow disappearing into the dark cedar draw before the kitchen lamp could flicker. Abby stood by the table, her hand resting flat on her husband's receipt, listening to the first sound of rain beginning to patter against the dry shake roof of the town. The rain didn't last. By midnight, the clouds had broken over the rimrock, leaving the mesquite wet and smelling of bitter leaf. The dampness didn't soak into the dirt. It just sat on the limestone crust, turning the trail into a slick slate that made a horse pick its way with its ears forward. Jesse Clanton sat in the brush 3 miles south of the Blackwood Gate and waited for the stage driver. He had the bay mare tied deep in a cedar mott where her breathing wouldn't carry to the road. He didn't build a fire. A fire on a ridge in 1878 was just an invitation for a rifle ball to find the center of your chest. He sat on his saddle blanket, his back against a post oak trunk, his fingers working a piece of dry tallow into the action of his Colt. Click, whir. The cylinder turned smooth. It didn't have no grit left in the teeth. By 2 in the morning, the rattle of a thoroughbrace coach came up from the draw. It wasn't the regular passenger run. It was the weekly mail skiff out of Clayton. 1 man on the box, 2 mules on the tongue, moving fast before the sun could heat up the axles. The driver was an old fellow named Huckby, his beard dyed down with a wool rag to keep the bugs out of his chin. He pulled the mules to a slithering stop, right where the cedar shadow crossed the road. He didn't look into the brush. He just dropped a small, grease-stained buckskin pouch into the buckberry bushes and let the whip crack. The coach rolled on, the iron tires throwing a shower of wet gravel into the dark. Jesse walked out and picked up the pouch. He didn't open it by the road. He went back to the cedar mott, struck a single lucifer under the bill of his hat, and flattened the paper out on his knee. It was a copy of the old Logan Vance ledger from the territorial prison at Huntsville. The handwriting belonged to Logan himself, written 3 months before the rope took him in 73. Jesse read the ink strokes. His thumb didn't shake, but his chest went tight, like a cinch strap being pulled 2 holes too short. Twist 6. The ledger didn't just list the gold pieces. Blackwood had paid for the Forsyth raid. It had a note in the margin, written in Logan S. thick, brutal hand. Put the Clanton boy on the ridge where the town posse can see his blue coat. If the federal judge looks into the fire, we give them the deserter. Blackwood gets the valley, and we get the clean trail. Jesse let the match burn down until the flame touched his thumbnail. He didn't blow it out. He let the heat sting his skin until the black charcoal crumbled into the damp grass. He wasn't the outrider who had failed to act out of fear. He was the steer they led into the chute with a bell around its neck. Blackwood had picked him 10 years ago because his coat was blue and his name didn't belong to no family in the county. He saddled the mare and rode toward the line shack. The kitchen lamp was already burning when he reached the creek bed. Abby Wright was standing by the window, a needle in her fingers, mending Wyatt's winter coat by the light of a tallow dip. The room was cold. The dampness came to the floorboards until the air smelled like an old cellar. Jesse stood in the doorway, the wet buckskin pouch in his hand. "You be back early, Mr. Clanton," Abby said, her needle stopping mid-stitch. Jessie laid the Huntsville paper on the table right next to her sewing basket. "You told me men have cracks in 'em, Abby. But you didn't tell me that some men are nothing but a crack with a gold ring on it." Abby read the ledger page. She didn't look up until she reached the bottom line, where Logan Vance had signed his mark. "You've been carrying a dead man's guilt, Jessie," she said softly. "The guilt is still mine, ma'am," Jesse said, his voice level, flat as the limestone ridge. "A man don't get a pass on his cowardice just because the devil planned the ambush from the start. I stood on that ridge and watched the smoke rise because I was scared of the rope. But Blackwood, he didn't just watch. He bought the oil. He bought the matches. And then he bought the town to keep anybody from looking at the grease on his fingers." Abby stood up, her hand resting on the wool coat she'd been mending. "A frontier tyrant. Don't just steal your land, Jesse. He steals your history. He wants you to believe you were a rogue, so you won't ever look at his ledger and see that he is the one who needs the pardon. When a community lets a merchant decide who is good and who is bad, they aren't living in a town no more. They read just living in a warehouse where the stock has been taught to fear the storekeeper." Jesse looked down at the paper. The ink seemed older now, small and dead against the pine table. "Marshal Harmon is at the county line," Jesse said. "He has got 4 deputies with him. They're carrying the federal writs under the anti-peonage law. But they won't move until the sun is up over the ridge." "Gideon won't wait for the sun, Jesse," Abby said. Her hand went down into her apron pocket, her fingers tightening around her husband's original receipt. "He's already moving the books out of the store. Wyatt saw the pack mules by the barn an hour ago. If Gideon gets those ledgers across the Mexican border, there won't be no evidence left for the marshal to read. The law don't have no teeth if the paper is on the other side of the river." Jesse turned back toward the door, his hand going down to the rawhide tie-off on his thigh. "He won't reach the river, Abby," Jesse said. "Don't you go out there looking for a shootout, Jesse Clanton?" Abby said, her voice rising, sharp as a school bell through the damp room. "An outlaw thinks he can wash away his past by spilling fresh blood on the trail. But that's just another form of henyot. It is easier to die in a ditch with a gun in your hand than it is to stand in a courtroom and tell 12 farmers that you were a fool for 10 years. We don't need another grave in this valley. We need the records." Jesse stopped on the sill. He didn't look back, but his shoulders dropped an inch, the blue cavalry wool tight against his shoulder blades. "The records are in his head. Then that's where we go," she said, pulling her gray wool shawl over her head and tying it tight beneath her chin. "Wyatt Stay with Toby. If the marshal comes down the ridge, you tell him, the widow is already at the store, counting the flour. The wind came out of the north by 4 in the morning, cold and sharp enough to make the cedar needles hiss like grease in a pan. The general store was dark, but a single yellow light was moving through the high windows of the back office, where Gideon Blackwood kept his safe. Abigail Wright didn't use the front road. She came through the alley behind the livery, her boots silent. In the wet manure dust, Jesse Clanton walking 2 paces behind her, with his Winchester held flat against his leg. The office door wasn't locked. A ranch like Blackwood's didn't need iron bolts when every man in the valley was too scared to lift his eyes from the dirt. Gideon was sitting at his desk, a heavy leather traveling trunk open on the floorboards beside him. He was throwing ledgers into the cedar box, thick, canvas-bound books, with index tabs that looked like old teeth. On the corner of the wood sat a fresh surveyor's map, the ink still smelling of vinegar and turpentine. Abby walked in first, her shawl dropping onto her shoulders, her red, split hands coming down flat on the desktop, right over the blue lines of the map. Gideon didn't reach for his drawer. He just stopped his hand mid-air, a small ledger held between his thick fingers. He looked at Abby. Then his eyes drifted to Jesse S. Blue Coat, standing in the dark frame of the door. "You re-out late, Abigail?" Gideon said, his voice smooth as lard on an axle. "The shearers will be wanting their coffee by 6. Abby didn't look at the ledgers in the trunk. She looked down at the blueprint beneath her palms. Twist 7. The lines didn't map the grass or the timber. They mapped the water table of the Pale Creek Valley, with a red circle drawn right around the old relay station her husband had built with his own hands. Texas Pacific Railroad Survey, 1877. Main Aquifer Hub. Thomas knew, Abby said, her voice coming out short, rhythmic, matching the ticking of the brass clock on the shelf. Gideon laid the small ledger into the trunk. He didn't deny it. Han tu how vidioda. Thomas was a stubborn man, Abby. He had $3,000 of railroad silver sitting right under his kitchen floor, and he wanted to keep it for an orchard. He didn't see that a railroad don't care about a widow's apple trees. The engine needs the water to make the steam, and the man who owns the water owns the whole valley from the railhead to the border. Jesse stepped into the lamplight, the muzzle of his Winchester tilted down toward the floorboards. "You didn't buy that water, Gideon. You killed for it. You threw a rope around a man S-horse because he wouldn't let you put his spring in your ledger. That ain't trade. That's just a bandit raid with a surveyor's map for a flag." Gideon leaned back in his oak chair, his gold eagle ring catching the yellow light of the lamp. "The frontier don't care about your names for it, Jesse. A railroad is 40 miles of steel moving south every month. It wants coal, it wants iron, and it wants deep water. If I didn't take that aquifer, some corporate fella from New York would have bought the county for taxes and left everybody to starve in the mesquite. I didn't kill Thomas Wright. The progress of this territory killed him. He was just a post-oak post sitting in the middle of the track." Abby reached into her bodice. She didn't pull out a pistol. She pulled out the oilcloth packet, tore the bladder skin away with her teeth, and laid the original 1875 receipt right over the railroad map. "The track don't belong to you, Gideon," Abby said. "That's just an old seed bill." "Abby," Gideon said, with a short, dry chuckle that sounded like gravel moving in a bucket. "It's a deed," Abby said, her finger coming down hard on the shaky script at the bottom. "Thomas registered this land under my name in Clayton 3 weeks before you had him killed. He knew you were changing the books. This paper has Silas S. name as a witness to the original $40 loan. Under the homestead law of this state, a widow's property can be seized for a store debt if the title was registered before the liability was entered. You don't own this valley, Gideon. You read just a tenant who is behind on his rent. Gideon S.'s face went white for the first time since he'd built the store. His hand moved toward the desk drawer, short, thick fingers reaching for the iron key. Jesse's Winchester didn't make a sound. He just stepped forward, the heavy steel barrel coming down flat across Gideon's wrist with a dull thud that made the inkwell jump. "Don't touch that drawer, Gideon," Jesse said. Outside, the first light of Tuesday morning was coming through the cedar gap, a gray, cold dawn that didn't have no red in it. From the north road came the sound of 6 horses moving at a steady trot, the iron shoes clicking sharp against the wet limestone. Marshal Harmon was riding down the main street, his blue wool coat soaked from the night trail, a leather case of federal writs resting across his saddle bow. Gideon looked out the window. He looked at the Huntsville ledger page Jesse had laid next to the map. He looked at his trunk full of canvas-bound books, his mouth worked violently, his gold ring tapping once against the wood, a small hollow sound that didn't carry past the desk line. "The town won't carry you, Abby," Gideon whispered, his voice going thin and old. "The farmers owe me for their seed. If I don't open the doors on Wednesday, there won't be no flour in the valley by Saturday night." Abby pulled her shawl back over her head, her face dark against the gray light of the window. "We'll eat cornmeal until the freight wagon comes from the north, Gideon," she said, her voice matching the steady, heavy trot of the marshal's horses outside. "A community can live a long time on dry bread if they know nobody is counting the crumbs to see how much they owe for the privilege of chewing. We've been living in your cage for 7 years. Storekeeper, we know how to be hungry, but we about to find out what it feels like to be clean." She picked up her husband's receipt, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't look back at the trunk or the map. She walked out onto the cedar porch, her boots leaving 2 dark tracks through the wet wood shavings Jesse had left behind. The marshal was already unhitching his team at the well. Pale Creek was beginning to wake up, the chimneys starting to puff their gray smoke into the morning air. But for the first time in 10 years, the ledger was open on the table, and the ink was about to dry in the light of day. The papers didn't look like much. Just 4 sheets of cream-colored legal stock, stamped with the seal of the United States District Court at Austin. They sat on the oak desk, where Gideon Blackwood, S-Leather Ledger, had lived for 15 years. Federal Marshal Harmon didn't raise his voice. He read the ink strokes with a slow, flat cadence that sounded like a man counting fence posts along a boundary line. "By authority of the Anti-Peonage Act of 1867, Harmon read, his thumb resting on the blue seal, "this court finds the labor covenant, dated April 3rd, 1878, to be null, void, and obtained through institutional coercion." Gideon Blackwood sat behind his desk. He looked smaller without his wool coat. His linen shirt was wrinkled at the armpits, the gray hair of his beard untrimmed where it met his collar. He looked down at his right hand. The gold signet ring was gone, confiscated into a leather property pouch sitting on the marshal's pack mule outside. "You're breaking the county, Marshal," Gideon whispered. His voice was dry, like corn shucks in a loft. "The farmers won't have no credit for the winter wheat." Abigail Wright stood by the window. The gray morning light came through the glass, catching the red, cracked skin of her knuckles. She didn't look at Gideon. She looked down at her 3 children waiting on the porch planking outside. "The county ain't breaking, Gideon," Abby said, her voice cutting through the room. "As damp silence like a clean axe stroke through cedar. It's just changing its currency. A town that buys its winter wheat with a widow's labor isn't a community. It's a debtor's pen. When a people learn to trade their neighbor's freedom for a sack of seed, they've already lost the crop. They're just harvesting the rot. Gideon didn't look up. He looked at the bare wood where his ledger used to sit. Marshall Harmon folded the sheets, slipped them into his leather case, and looked at Jesse Clanton. Jesse was leaning against the doorframe, his Winchester resting across his boot, his blue key-bin jacket unbuttoned at the throat to let the cool north wind hit his skin. "The Huntsville record is clear, Clanton," Harmon said, his hand resting on the lapel of his coat. "The Vance gang ledger proves you were used as an outrider without intent. Your name is cleared from the territorial boundary books." Jesse didn't move. He didn't take his hand off his rifle barrel. He looked out at the main street of Pale Creek, where the townspeople were beginning to gather around the well. They didn't speak. They just stood there, their hats in their hands, watching the federal horses stamp their hooves in the white mud. "A clean name don't wash out an old trail, Marshal," Jesse said, his voice dropping down into that low, gravelly drawl. "It don't wash it out, Jesse," Abby said, walking over to the door and standing right beside him, her gray wool shawl catching on the cedar latch. "But it gives you the right to stop running. An outlaw thinks his life is defined by the county lines he crosses when the posse is behind him. But true freedom ain't the distance you ride from a fire. It's the decision to stand on a piece of ground, clear the brush, and build a house with a door that don't need a padlock." Jessie looked at her. Her face was lined from the wind, her apron stiff with the grease of another man's kitchen, but her eyes were clear as riverstone. He reached up, took his hat off his head, and looked at the inside of the crown. He'd carried 3 different names inside that hat through 4 territories. He'd told himself he was just a ghost with a horse and a cartridge belt. But a ghost don't have no use for a deep water well or a widow's orchard. "The bay mare is healed, Abby," Jesse said softly. "I know she is," she replied. "She can carry 200 pounds if the trail is flat." Abby looked down the road that led back to the small relay station, where the timber was still square and the well went down into the limestone aquifer. "The trail ain't flat, Jesse," Abby said, her fingers tightening around the cedar bird Wyatt had carved for his sister. "The frontier don't give you a smooth road just because you got a legal paper in your pocket. A contract don't dig a ditch, and a federal marshal don't plow the field. The law can only pull the weeds out of your garden. If you want the corn to grow, you've got to stay in the furrow until your boots are full of dirt." Jesse nodded once. Short, sharp. The gesture of a man who had finally figured out where his boundary lines were. He walked out onto the porch, his long legs moving with that slow, steady swing, and picked up the hemp rope tied to the front axle of the Wright family flatbed. The town of Pale Creek didn't make a sound as the wagon rolled down the street. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the quiet of a valley that had been holding its breath for 15 years and was finally learning how to fill its lungs. Silas the blacksmith stood in the door of his shop, his tongs resting on the anvil, his face gray from the coal dust, but his chin held level. He didn't look away when Jesse passed. He gave a short, slow nod, the greeting of an honest mechanic who had finally looked at his own iron and found the strength to tell the truth. Circuit Judge Henderson was sitting on the porch of the land office, his spectacles off, his white hair moving in the April breeze. He was holding the 1871 ledger in his lap, the forged pages turned down into the dark where the ink couldn't do no more damage to a man's name. By noon, the wagon reached the ridge above Medina Creek. The old tramp Zung Chun was still there, the pine planks bleached gray by the sun, the stone chimney standing tall against the blue Texas sky. The padlock on the kitchen door was gone, broken open by the marshals, crowbar an hour before dawn. Wyatt jumped down from the sideboards before the wheels stopped turning. He didn't run to the well. He walked straight to the kitchen porch, his 12-year-old hands tracing the spot on the doorframe where his father had carved his stature line every spring. Sadie followed him, her faceless rag doll tucked under her arm, her boots making a light, happy clicking against the pine steps. Toby was already out of his wool coat, his small legs moving fast through the wild mustard stalks in the yard, his laugh coming loud and clean across the pasture. Abby didn't go inside the house right away. She walked down to the wellhead, where the cedar bucket was sitting on the stone rim. Jesse Clanton walked down beside her. He didn't have his Winchester in his hand. He'd left it booted in the wagon, box's belt, riding high and comfortable on his hip like a tool. Instead of a weapon, he took the hemp rope, hooked the iron bail of the bucket, and let it drop into the dark hole. Thud splash, the sound came up from 40 feet down, deep and hollow, the echo carrying the cold smell of living water. Jesse hauled the line, his thick shoulders working with the same rhythm he'd used on Blackwood porch sills. He set the bucket on the dry stones and offered the tin dipper to Abby. "That's good water, ma'am," Jesse said. Abby drank. The water was iron cold, sweet, with the flavor of the limestone deep under the range. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and handed the dipper to the boy, who had come down to see the bucket. "You remember this water, Wyatt," Abby said, her voice dropping into that steady, pioneer cadence her father had used when the grass was dry. "This aquifer don't belong to the railroad, and it don't belong to the storekeeper. It belongs to the land, and the land belongs to the people who are willing to sweat for it without selling their name to pay for the bucket. A man can live without a railroad, son. He can even live without a store. But he can live if his water comes out of another man's ledger." Wyatt took the dipper, his gray eyes locked on his mother's face. "The railroad is still coming, Ma." "Let them come," Abby said, looking over at Jesse, who had taken his saddle off the bay mare and was hanging it over the top rail of the cedar corral. "When the surveyors get here, they find a house with an honest foundation and a well that's been paid for with clean cash. They won't find no widow in a line shack. They'll find a family that knows the value of a piece of cedar and a straight name." Jesse walked back up the path, his boots crunching slow on the gravel. He didn't say nothing about staying. He didn't make no promises about the winter wheat or the spring shearing. He just picked up the water bucket, his thorap, hand catching the wooden bail right where Abby's fingers had been, and carried it toward the kitchen door. The sun was high over Pale Creek, now the gray April clouds turning into big white cottonwoods against the blue sky. The valley was wide, open all the way to the southern ridge, where the river ran clean through the brush. Abby Wright stepped over her own threshold, her hand resting flat against the pine door jamb, her body filling the frame. She could smell the wood smoke starting to come out of her own chimney, a thin, white line that didn't have no soot or forgery in it. She looked at the kitchen table. The 3 wooden chairs weren't there, yet they were still in the back of the flatbed wagon, waiting to be unloaded. But the table wasn't empty. Sitting right in the center of the clean pine wood, where the starlight could find it through the window, was the small cedar roadrunner Jesse had carved by the livery well. It didn't make no noise. It didn't have no price tag on it. It was just a piece of wood that had been shaped by a man who had decided to stop running and a woman who had refused to bend. And on the Texas frontier in 1878, that was enough to build a town on. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
And so the water came up clean from 40 feet down, cold, sweet, iron sharp with the taste of deep limestone. It hadn't changed. It had been there the whole time, under the parched ground, under the forged deeds and the doubled ledgers and the gold eagle ring. The truth always is. It just waits for someone stubborn enough to drop a bucket. This is a story about a woman who never once picked up a gun. That is not an accident. Abigail Wright understood something that the men around her spent years learning the hard way. That real power on the frontier was never the cartridge in the belt. It was the paper in the pocket. It was the ability to read the fine print before you put your name on the line. Gideon Blackwood didn't steal from her with violence. He stole from her with a ledger, a smooth voice, and the calculated cruelty of a man who knew exactly how hungry you have to be before you stop reading what you are signing. He built his empire on one single bet, that a Goa foo with 3 children and an empty flour sack wouldn't have the education, the nerve, or the time to look closely at the numbers. He was wrong on every count, and that wrongness cost him everything. But Abby's story is not simply a triumph of intelligence over corruption. It is something deeper. It is a lesson about what kind of strength actually lasts. Because Abby could have signed that labor covenant, worked her year, paid her manufactured debt, and survived. She could have bent. Many people did. The whole town had been bending for 15 years, and Gideon called that order. He called it civilization. He called it the natural arrangement of the frontier, where the man with the supply wagon was entitled to the labor of everyone who depended on it. What Abby refused, quietly, consistently, at enormous cost, was the premise. She refused to accept that hunger was a moral argument. She refused to accept that her children needing salt pork on Tuesday gave a man the right to own her Wednesday. A debt is a number on a piece of paper. It is not a brand on your skin. Her father taught her that, and she taught it to Wyatt, kneeling down to look him in the eye the way you do when you are passing something on that you need to survive. And then there is Jesse Clanton, the drifter who arrived carrying a name he was ashamed of and a past he had misread for a decade. His story is the story of what guilt does to a man when it has no outlet and no truth to anchor itself to. Jesse believed he was the outrider. He believed he was the coward who watched the smoke rise and did nothing. And he was partially right. The cowardice was real, and he had no business running from it. But the full picture was worse, and in a strange way, more forgivable than the story he had been telling himself. Blackwood had planned him into the crime. He had been a prop, a useful silhouette in a blue coat standing on a ridge so that the right people would see a deserter and not a murder. That revelation did not excuse Jesse. He said so himself, plainly and without self-pity. A man doesn't get a pass on his cowardice just because the devil planned the ambush. But it changed the direction of his guilt. It gave it somewhere honest to go. Not toward a grave in a ditch with a gun in his hand, but toward a courtroom, a well, and a piece of ground worth staying on. What this story hands you, finally, is a very old and very necessary truth about community. A town is not built by the man who owns the store. A town is built by the people who decide, together, that they are worth more than what someone else is willing to pay for their labor. Gideon Blackwood told Pale Creek that without him, they would have no salt, no credit, no flour, no winter wheat. And he was right for exactly one terrible week. But Abby Wright told the same town something he never could, that a community which feeds itself on a neighbor's hunger will eventually starve on its own. You cannot build a lasting town on a widow's broken knuckles and a dead man's forged signature. The foundation rots from the inside, and no amount of expensive cedar siding will keep the roof from coming down. The cedar roadrunner on the kitchen table didn't cost $1. It didn't carry a deed or a federal seal or a sworn affidavit. It was just a piece of wood shaped by a man who finally decided to stop moving. And sitting there in the morning light, in a kitchen with 3 chairs still to be unloaded from the wagon, it was worth more than everything in Gideon Blackwood's trunk. Because some things on the Texas frontier cannot be entered into a ledger. The sound of a child laughing in the wild mustard, clean water coming up cold from the limestone, a name you do not have to hide inside the band of your hat. Those things belong to the people who are willing to sweat for them without selling themselves to pay for the bucket. And that, on the frontier or anywhere else, is enough to build a town on.